a time of war, they risked everything that they knew and loved, not for money or a prize, but for their country. They came from our families. They are part of us. World War I saw much suffering for Australia. On Anzac Day we remember the war, the battles, the battalions, the soldiers, but we sometimes forget that families suffered too. From a population of fewer than 5 million, almost 500,000 men enlisted, leaving behind nearly 1 million parents when they left for war. Of those that enlisted, over 60,000 were killed, and 156,000 were wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. Several soldiers came from West Guildford, and some of their names appear on the memorial here behind us. But what do you know about these brave soldiers and their families? And I want to introduce to you the Devereux and Young families of West Guildford. John Devereux of Perth Road, West Guildford, had 4 sons who enlisted in the 1st AIF. William George Devereux was the first to enlist in 1915, aged 27. He gave his occupation as a labourer. Standing 5 foot 7 inches tall, he had a ruddy complexion, grey eyes and brown hair. William was allocated the service number 3439 and embarked with the 16th Battalion. He was later taken on strength with the 24th Howitzer Brigade. In June 1916 he was stricken with influenza, again in August 1917 and yet again in May 1918, and was later to return home. William George Devereux died aged 67 on the 21st of May 1955 and is buried in the Midland Cemetery. In August 1915, the second of John Devereux's sons to enlist was John Jr. He was aged 29 and employed as a fettler. John was issued the service number of 3885, and like his brother William, he left with the 16th Battalion and was later taken on strength with the 24th Howitzer Brigade. John stood 5 foot 10 inches tall, had fair complexion, blue eyes and brown hair. At the time of his enlistment, John was married. His wife's name was Edith May, and she was living with the Devereux family in West Guildford. John was constantly in hospital with bronchitis and one occasion with influenza. He was also gassed, and his ill health eventually saw him sent back home. John Devereux Jr. died in 1927, aged 47, just 12 years after enlisting. His body was buried in an Anglican section at Karrakatta Cemetery. The third of the Devereux sons to enlist was Alfred Thomas. He enlisted in November 1915, gave his age as 26, and stated his occupation was that of a labourer. He stood 5 foot 9 inches tall, had fresh complexion, grey eyes and brown hair. Alfred was allocated the service number of 4488 and formed part of the 11th Battalion. Alfred was in hospital ill during July 1916, and during the Battle of Menin Road near Ypres on the 21st of September 1917, he received wounds to his hip and arm. He was wounded in action again in May 1918, and during the fighting at Lyon on the 10th of August 1918, Alfred Thomas Devereux was killed. He is buried in the Heath Cemetery in Bassendean, France. He was just 29 years old. Andrew Lewis Devereux was the youngest of the 4 brothers to enlist in December 1915, aged 19. He gave his occupation as a fettler. He stood 5 foot 8 inches tall, had a fair complexion, blue eyes and fair hair. Andrew was allocated the service number of 4793 and formed part of the 48th Battalion, and was wounded at Pozières in August 1916, receiving a gunshot wound to the hand. In October 1917 at Bassendean, he was wounded again, receiving a gunshot wound to the temple and the right shoulder. Andrew was sent home and died at the age of 64 in 1961. His body was cremated at Karrakatta Cemetery and his ashes placed in one of the rose gardens. William and Amelia Young had 2 sons that went off to war. The first to enlist in August 1915 was Frederick William, aged 31. He gave his occupation as a farmer. He stood 5 foot 5 inches tall, had dark complexion with brown eyes and dark brown hair. Frederick was allocated the service number of 3517 and became a member of the 11th Battalion. He disembarked in Marseille in France on the 5th of July 1916, and within 10 weeks he was declared missing in action during the fighting at Poitiers. Francis Henry Young enlisted in October in 1915, giving his age as 19 and his occupation as that of a butcher. Francis was allocated the service number of 4631 and became a member of the 51st Battalion. He disembarked in Marseille in France on the 12th of June 1916, 3 weeks before his brother Frederick. On September 1916, he too was declared missing in action, just 5 weeks after his brother. The Army duly notified William and Amelia Young that both their sons were missing in action, and after almost 6 months, and no doubt out of frustration and pain, a letter was written to Base Records that reads, "Could you please give me any information as to whereabouts of the 2 undermentioned soldiers? There has been no news of them since they were declared missing." A letter was received dated the 13th of February 1917. In reply to your undated letter, I regret to state no further information has been received concerning number 3517 Private F.W. Young 11th Battalion, reported missing the 25th of July 1916, or number 4631 Private F.H. Young of the 51st Battalion, reported missing the 3rd of September 1916. The overseas authorities are doing everything within their power to trace missing men, and any information coming to hand concerning either of the above soldiers will be promptly reported to next of kin. Almost a year later, following an investigation into the fate of Francis, a letter from Base Records dated the 11th of July 1917 was sent to the father stating, "With reference to the report of the regrettable loss of your son, the late number 4731 Private F.H. Young 51st Battalion, I am now in receipt of advice that shows that he was killed in action in France on the 3rd of September 1916 and was buried in the vicinity of Thiepval. These additional details are furnished by direction, it being the policy of the Department to forward information in connection with the deaths of members of the Australian Imperial Force." A court of inquiry into the fate of Frederick was held on the 20th of June 1917, almost a year after he was posted missing.